The morning had barely settled into the great hall when Esther Coyle heard the thing she was never meant to hear. She was on her knees in the cold gallery above the blue drawing-room, a cloth in one raw hand and a tin of beeswax at her side, and through the carved balustrade the two voices rose to her clear as bells over still water. One belonged to Lady Prudence Marchcroft, aunt to the house, mistress of its keys and all but name. The other belonged to the family solicitor, a thin gray man who came on the second Tuesday of every month. Esther did not mean to stop working. She meant to be a shadow, as she had been trained to be. And yet the words that reached her were not the words of a woman arranging linens or ordering coal. They were the words of a woman deciding, in a low and unhurried voice, how a boy of 11 might be removed from an inheritance that the law had already granted him. She held her breath. She did not move. And she understood, in the space of a single sentence, that if either of them looked up and found her there, she would not keep her place in the house past nightfall. You have felt it too, perhaps, that particular stillness of a body that has learned too much too fast. Stay with her a moment. She is going to need someone to. Esther Coyle was 23, and she had been in service at Harrogate since the spring. Her father's small holding was sold to pay a debt that was not, in truth, his own. She had come to the house as a housemaid, with 2 gray gowns and a good hand for figures that no one had ever asked to see. To the household below stairs she was steady and plain, a quiet woman who did her work and kept her thoughts behind her teeth. To Lady Prudence she was less than that. She was furniture that walked. And it was precisely because she was furniture that walked that she now knelt above, a conversation no one had thought to guard, because who guards a room? Against a chair, the house belonged, by every legal right, to Thomas. The boy was the son of the late Lord Harrogate, and his lady, both taken by a fever within a single fortnight, 3 winters past, and the estate had passed to Thomas with all its acres and its rents and its grey stone weight. Until he came of age, the management of it fell to his nearest guardian, and his nearest guardian was his father's sister, Lady Prudence, who had arrived the month of the funerals in black bombazine and had never once left. She managed the house, she managed the tenants, she managed, most of all, the boy who was small for his age and grave in the eyes, and who flinched when she entered a room in a way that Esther had noticed and said nothing about, because a housemaid who notices such things and speaks of them does not remain a housemaid for long. What Esther heard that morning arranged all her small, silent noticings into a single terrible shape. Lady Prudence was speaking of a physician in London, a man of accommodating opinions, who might be brought to certify that the boy was unwell in his mind. She was speaking of a cousin, a Mr. Bree, Rutherford, who stood next in the line, should Thomas be set aside, and who had already agreed, it seemed, to a generous settlement, in exchange for his gratitude. She was speaking of papers to be drawn slowly so that no single act should look like a theft. And the grey solicitor was murmuring his cautions and his conditions, but he was not refusing. That was the thing Esther could not unhear. He was not refusing. She waxed the same 6 inches of banister for a quarter of an hour after the voices moved away, because her hands did not trust themselves to do anything else. By evening, she had told no one. There was no one to tell. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dell, took her orders from Lady Prudence, and her small comforts from Lady Prudence's approval, and would sooner dismiss a maid than doubt her mistress. The footman laughed too easily and forgot too quickly. The boy himself was 11, and frightened and could do nothing with the knowledge but carry it, which would only make him more frightened. And Esther Coyle was a servant with 2 grey gowns and a wage of £8 a year. And the word of such a woman against the word of a lady was not a thing that any court in England had ever been built to hear. She lay awake in the narrow attic bed with the cold pressing at the small window. And she told herself the sensible thing, the thing her father would have told her if her father were living. She told herself it was not her house, not her boy, not her fight. She told herself that a woman with nothing must guard the nothing she has. And then she thought of the way Thomas flinched, and she found that the sensible thing would not stay said. What she did not yet know was that the house was about to receive a visitor, who kept his own counsel as carefully as she kept hers. He arrived on the Thursday. in a traveling coach, mud to the axle, and the household turned out to receive him with the particular flurry that attends a man whose presence is inconvenient. His name was Julian Ashworth, Viscount Denby, and he was cousin to the late Lord Harrowgate on the mother's side, which made him a species of relation to the boy and no species of relation to Lady Prudence at all. He had written to say he would come. He had not asked whether it was convenient. Esther, carrying a coal scuttle across the far end of the entrance hall, saw him only in passing, a tall, dark figure handing down his own gloves, rather than waiting for a footman to take them, and she noted the thing without knowing why she noted it. A man who does not wait to be served has generally learned not to trust the service. Lord Denby was 32, though the set of his mouth made him seem older, and he had spent the better part of the last 4 years abroad on business no one at Harrowgate could name with any confidence. He was dark-haired and broad through the shoulder, with a scar, faint and pale, running through the outer edge of his left brow, the sort of mark a man does not explain, and no one asks after twice. His eyes were a gray so dark they read as slate in poor light, and he had a way of going entirely still when he was thinking that unsettled people who were used to filling silence with chatter. Lady Prudence disliked him on sight. Esther watched her dislike him from the shadow of the servants' passage and filed the fact away where she filed everything. For 2 days, Esther watched the Viscount move through the house like a man taking inventory. He asked the steward for the account books, and read them by the window in the long gallery, and Esther, dusting the far shelves with a cloth she had already run twice over clean wood, saw how his stillness sharpened over certain pages. She learned the language of that stillness, without meaning to. There was the ordinary stillness of a man reading, in which the shoulders eased and the breath went slow. And there was the other kind which came over him at particular columns of figures, a stillness in which nothing eased at all, in which the whole long body went quiet the way the air goes quiet before weather. He would set one finger against a line and hold it there, not tapping, only resting, as though marking a place he meant to return to. Twice she saw him lift his eyes from the page and look at nothing for the length of several breaths, and then look down and read the same line again. He asked to see the boy, and the boy was produced, scrubbed and silent and holding his own hands in front of him the way frightened children do, and the Viscount crouched to speak with him at his own height, which no adult in that house had done in 3 years. Esther, folding linens at the gallery's end, watched the child's shoulders come down by a small degree, the smallest thawing, as a person warms who has stood too long in a cold room and does not quite trust the fire. He asked Thomas whether he liked to ride, and Thomas said he was not permitted, and something passed over the Viscount's face, a small hardening at the jaw, gone before it could be named. He did not press the boy. He only said, in that low, even voice, that a house with such stables ought to have a boy on a horse in it, and that he would see to it, and Thomas looked at him as though he had promised the moon, and could not decide whether to believe a man capable of it. Esther saw all of it. She was beginning to understand that she saw a great many things that were not meant to be seen, and that the knowledge sat in her like a stone she could neither swallow nor spit out. She had spent 3 years teaching herself not to notice, because noticing was dangerous for a woman in her position, and now she found the habit would not obey her. She noticed the way Lady Prudence's greeting to the Viscount cooled by a precise degree each morning. She noticed the grey solicitor's carriage in the yard on a day that was not a second Tuesday. She noticed, and she carried. And the carrying grew heavier by the hour. On the 3rd night, she made her choice, and it was not a brave choice so much as a choice she could no longer avoid. She could not go to a magistrate who would laugh. She could not go to Mrs. Dell, who would report her. There was, however, one person under that roof who had read the account books with a sharpening stillness and crouched to a frightened boy's height, and who had no love for Lady Prudence and no stake in her schemes. It was madness for a maid to seek a private word with the Viscount. It could cost her everything she had, which was little, and everything she was, which was more. She went anyway down the servants' stair and along the cold corridor to the library, where his candle still burned. And she knocked, and when he said enter, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, which a maid must never do, and she stood with her raw hands folded and her heart loud in her throat, and she told him what she had heard. He did not laugh. That was the first thing. He set down his book and he looked at her. All of that dark, still attention turned upon her at once, and he said in a low and level voice, "Sit down." It was not a courtesy. It was very nearly a command. And yet there was a chair drawn near the fire, and it was warmer than any place she had sat in 3 years, and she understood dimly that the command was a kindness wearing the only clothes it owned. She did not sit at first, she told him standing, because she did not trust the softness of the chair to let her keep her nerve. She told him about the second Tuesday and the gray solicitor, and the physician of accommodating opinions, and the cousin named Rutherford in the papers to be drawn slowly. She told him without ornament, in the plain descending order of a woman who has arranged the facts many times in the dark, and when she had finished, the Viscount was silent for so long that she thought she had ruined herself, that he would ring the bell and have her turned out for slandering the mistress of the house. Instead he said, "You are certain of the name." "Rutherford." "Yes, my lord." "And the physician, did she name him?" "She did not, my lord. Only that he was in London, and that he was," she said, "a man who understood the delicacy of families." The Viscount rose then and went to the window, and stood with his back to her, and the firelight caught the pale line of the scar through his brow. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, gone quieter, and somehow further away. "I had a sister," he said, and Esther went very still, because she understood that she was being given something, and that it was costly. "I had a sister who tried to tell a room full of certain men that she was being wronged, and not one of them believed her, because she was young, and she was a woman, and the man she accused was respectable. She was right. They were wrong. By the time it was proven she was past the help of it, he turned back to face Esther, and his eyes in the firelight were not cold at all. He said, "I have spent a great many years since learning to believe the person no one else will. Sit down, Miss Coyle. You have carried this alone long enough." And this time she sat. Something changed in the house after that night, though nothing changed that anyone could point to. The Viscount did not confront Lady Prudence. He did not summon the magistrate or write to London or do any of the loud things Esther had half feared and half hoped. He grew quieter instead and more thorough. He stayed a week past the time his business should have called him away. He read the account books twice more. He rode out to the tenant farms and came back with his mouth set in a harder line. And once, passing Esther on the gallery stair, he paused and said, "Only, has she spoken again in your hearing?" And Esther said, "No, my lord, she has grown careful." And he nodded, as though this too were information, and went on. The trouble was that Lady Prudence, whatever her failings, was not a stupid woman. She had marked the Viscount's lengthening stay. She had marked, too, some alteration she could not source, a sense that the walls of her own house had grown ears. She did not know it was Esther. She knew only that it was someone. And a woman who is planning a slow and careful theft does not care to be watched by anyone at all. She began, in the small ways available to a mistress, to make the household narrower for the servants who displeased her. And it was Esther she settled on, though not because she knew, but because Esther was the kind of quiet that unsettled a guilty conscience. Lady Prudence found fault with her work where there was none. She moved her from the good work of the upper rooms to the raw work of the scullery and the coal. She spoke of her, in the hearing of the other servants, as a sly creature, a maid who crept where she was not wanted, a girl who thought too well of herself, for a girl with nothing. The other servants who took their weather from the mistress began to look at Esther sidelong. That was the cost of it. Esther had known there would be a cost. She had not known it would be loneliness, which is the cheapest and the dearest of all the coins the mighty can spend. She bore it. She had borne worse. She had not counted, though, on how it would feel to be watched by everyone and believed by only one, and to have that one be a man so far above her that a single word between them in a public corridor would ruin them both, for that was the shape of the thing. Now the Viscount believed her. And belief is a private country. And they lived in a public one, and every glance he gave her, in a room full of people, had to be a glance that meant nothing at all. You know this feeling, I think, to be seen truly by one person, and to have that seeing be the one thing you can never let the world observe. Hold on to it. It is going to matter more than either of them yet knows. And now back to the house, where the aunt was about to make her move. It came at the worst possible moment, which is where such things always come. Lady Prudence had planned a dinner, a modest country dinner for a handful of neighboring families, and Esther understood too late that it was nothing so ordinary at all. Among the guests was Mr. Blank, Rutherford, the cousin, brought down from London, under the flag of ordinary family feeling. And among the guests, too, was a stranger, a Dr. Fenwick, introduced as a friend of the family, with an interest in the boy's education. Esther, serving at the table because the household was short and she had been put back into the upper rooms for the single evening to make up the number, understood the whole design in one cold instant. The physician had been brought to the boy at last. The certification was to begin, and it was to begin here tonight, under cover of soup and civility, with the Viscount present so that he might be made to seem to have been consulted. She could not speak. A maid does not speak at a dinner table. She could only move around the edges of the room with a tureen and a steady face, while the trap she had reported closed slowly in the candlelight before her. Lady Prudence guided the talk with the ease of a woman who has rehearsed it. She spoke of poor dear Thomas, of his nervous constitution, of the sad delicacy he had inherited from his mother's people. She spoke of how she lay awake worrying that the burden of the estate would be too much for so fragile a child. And Dr. Fenwick, on his cue, murmured of cases he had known, of young minds unequal to great responsibilities, of the kindness, the real kindness, of relieving them of a weight they were never made to bear. Esther set down a dish of glazed carrots with hands that did not shake, because she would not give the woman the satisfaction, and she looked, once, across the room at the Viscount. He was watching Lady Prudence with an expression of perfect polite attention. To anyone else at that table he was a bored guest, enduring a tedious concern. Esther, though, had spent a week learning the small country of his face, and she saw beneath the boredom a stillness gone absolutely rigid, the stillness of a man holding something very heavy, without letting his arms be seen to strain. He knew what this was. He had known before she signaled it, and he was waiting, she understood, waiting the way a man waits who has learned that the loud, early word saves no one, and only warns the enemy. The dark moment came after the ladies had withdrawn, when Esther, clearing the last of the plates from the empty dining room, found Lady Prudence waiting for her in the doorway. The mistress of Harrogate did not raise her voice. She never did. She stood with her fan closed in her hand, and she looked at Esther for a long moment, and then she said quite softly, "You have been carrying tales." Esther said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not make it worse. "I do not know yet exactly what you have said," Lady Prudence went on, "or to whom, though I have my suspicions and they are improving by the hour. I want you to understand your situation, because I do not think you understand it. You have no character but the one I give you. You have no wage but the one I pay you. And if you are turned out of this house, without a reference, in the middle of winter, with a whisper following you that you are a thief and a liar, you will not find another place in this county, or any other. You will find the workhouse, or the road, or worse." She opened her fan and looked at Esther over the top of it. "Do you understand me now?" she said. "Nod, if you understand me." And Esther, who had faced this woman's cruelty for weeks in small increments, felt the whole weight of it land at once, and understood that everything she had was in this woman's closed hand, and that a single word would drop it all into the dark. She thought of the boy. She thought of the flinch. She thought of a young woman years ago in a room full of certain men who would not believe her. She lifted her chin and she said, in a voice that was quiet and did not shake, "I understand you very well, my lady. I have always understood you. It was not defiance as the world stages defiance. It was smaller and harder than that. It was a woman, with nothing declining to pretend she had less. And Lady Prudence's face, for just a moment, lost its polish. And Esther saw beneath it the thing that drove all of this, which was not greed exactly, but fear. The fear of a woman who had spent her whole life being nearly great and could not bear now to be nearly great and old. It did not make Esther forgive her. It made her see her, though, and seeing is its own kind of standing upright. That night Esther was told she would be dismissed in the morning. Mrs. Dell brought the word without meeting her eyes. She was to be gone before the household woke, without a reference, without the wages owed her for the quarter, turned out onto the frozen road with her 2 gray gowns in a bundle and her name already poisoned behind her. She sat on the edge of the narrow attic bed, and she did not weep, because weeping was a warmth she could not afford, and she made herself think coldly and clearly about how far she could walk in a day, and which of the market towns might have work that did not require a character. There was a knock at the attic door near midnight, so soft she thought. At first she had imagined it. It was not the Viscount. A Viscount does not climb to the servants' attic, not even a Viscount such as this one. It was a boy. It was Thomas in his nightshirt, with a candle guttering in his hand and his grave eyes enormous in the dark, and he said, "They say you are being sent away because of me," and Esther's carefully built coldness cracked straight down the middle. She knelt, and she told him it was not his fault, that nothing that was happening was his fault. And the boy looked at her with the terrible clear sight of a frightened child and said, "Cousin Julian will not let it happen. He believes you. He told me so." And Esther understood, kneeling on the cold attic floor with the child's candle between them, that the Viscount had done a thing she had not known he was doing. He had told the boy. Quietly at the boy's own height, he had let Thomas know that he was not alone, and not mad, and not going to be given away, and the knowledge had been sitting in the child like a small, warm coal all through that dreadful dinner. It was not rescue, not yet, and it was the opposite of the flinch, and it had come from the one man in the house who had chosen to believe a maid. The morning that was to see Esther turned out onto the road saw something else instead. She was in the kitchen passage before dawn, her bundle at her feet, when Mrs. Dell came to tell her that she was wanted in the long gallery, and that she was not, after all, to leave. Esther went up, not knowing what she would find, and what she found was the whole apparatus of the theft assembled and waiting, and turned entirely on its head. The Viscount stood at the center of the gallery in the gray morning light. Beside him stood a second solicitor. Not the Grey Tuesday man, but a stranger. A sharp-eyed London lawyer the Viscount had sent for a week ago without a word to anyone. Lady Prudence was there, and Mr. Rutherford, and Dr. Fenwick. All of them summoned before they had quite finished dressing, all of them wearing the particular pallor of people who have realized too late that the ground has moved. The Viscount did not shout. Esther would remember all her life how quiet he was. He laid it out the way she had laid it out for him that first night, in the plain descending order of facts, and the facts were no longer a maid's unsupported word. In the week of his lengthening stay, he had written to London. He had traced Dr. Fenwick, whose license to practice had been suspended 2 years past for exactly the accommodating opinions Lady Prudence had purchased. He had traced Mr. Purr, Rutherford's debts, which were considerable, and the settlement promised him, which was written down in a hand the London lawyer now held. He had found the Tuesday solicitor's draft papers, incomplete, in a locked drawer that a locked drawer had not been enough to protect, and he read out a single line of them in his low-level voice, and the line was enough. The theft laid bare in the morning light could not survive being looked at. Lady Prudence tried once to do the thing that had always worked. She drew herself up, and she said in her softest and most dangerous voice, "And on whose word does his lordship build this extravagant accusation?" On the word of a dismissed housemaid, a sly girl with a grudge, and a gift for invention. And the Viscount looked at her, and then he crossed the length of the gallery, unhurried, until he stood beside Esther, and he turned to face the assembled room, and he said the thing that ended it. I builded on the word of an honest woman. 6 words. He did not embellish them. He did not turn them into a speech. He let them stand in the gray light with the whole weight of his rank behind them. And the room understood all at once that the account was closed. A viscount had crossed a room to stand beside a housemaid and had called her honest before her betters. And there was no undoing that, no arranging it into something else, no fan raised high enough to hide behind. Rutherford was already reaching for his hat. Dr. Fenwick had gone the color of ash. And Lady Prudence stood alone in the middle of her own scheme, her fan hanging useless in her hand, and Esther watched the polish leave her face for the last time, and something older and emptier take its place. She was not destroyed. That was not the shape justice took that morning, and Esther found she did not wish it to be. Lady Prudence was removed from the guardianship by the law the London lawyer set in motion within the month. She was granted a small annuity, enough to live in narrow respectability in a town far from Harrogate, and she was required to go and never to return, and she went. It was not the workhouse, it was not the road. It was, instead, the exact narrowing of a life that she had tried to inflict on a child, measured back to her without cruelty and without excess. And Esther, who might have been forgiven a moment of triumph, felt only a grave and tired quiet as the carriage took the woman down the drive. The boy kept his house. That was the thing that mattered, and it was done, and it held. There was one more account, though quieter than all the rest, that had not yet been settled, and it was settled slowly, across the weeks that followed, in the small daily country of a house learning to breathe again. The Viscount did not go abroad. His business, whatever it had been, seemed to release its hold on him. Or perhaps he released his hold on it. He stayed at Harrogate as the boy's guardian, in fact, now as well as feeling, and the house under his hand grew warmer by degrees, the fires larger, the meals kinder, the servants easier in their skins. Esther was restored to the upper rooms, and more than restored, though the alteration in her position was a thing no one quite spoke aloud. Mrs. Sackted Dell, who had brought the word of her dismissal without meeting her eyes, now met her eyes and could not quite hold them, and was in her stiff way almost kind, which was the nearest a woman like Mrs. Dell could come to an apology. The other servants, who had learned to look at Esther sidelong, unlearned it slowly, the way a household unlearns any weather once the sky above it changes. Esther bore their softening as she had borne their coldness, without comment, because she had discovered in herself a great reluctance to make anyone pay for having been afraid. She knew what fear cost. She had paid it herself for 3 years. She found the account books left open on the gallery table where she dusted, and she understood after the 3rd or 4th evening that they were left open on purpose, that a man who locked his correspondence in London did not leave his ledgers spread by accident. It was an invitation written in the only language a careful man trusted, which was the language of things done rather than things said. One evening, half in defiance of every rule she had ever kept, she took up the pen that had been left not quite by accident in the fold of the open book, and she corrected a sum in the margin, in her good clear hand, the figures she had kept behind her teeth for 3 years, finally set down where another person might see them. She left it, and said nothing, and lay awake half the night wondering whether she had presumed too far. The next morning the correction had been initialed in a dark, decisive hand beneath her own, and beside it, in the same hand, a single word: "Thank you." She stood over it a long moment in the gray morning light, that small word doing something to her chest that 8 pounds a year and 2 gray gowns had never taught her to expect. It was the first time in 3 years that a thing she had done well had been seen by someone with the power to say so. She closed the book and went about her work, and she carried the 2 syllables with her all that day like a warm coal in a cold pocket. They did not speak of what was growing between them, because neither of them had the words yet, and both of them had reasons to fear the having of them. He was a viscount, she was a housemaid. The distance between those 2 facts was the distance the whole of England was built to keep. And the body knows things, The mouth will not yet say. Esther knew exactly where he was in any room she entered without looking, the way she had once known where danger was. Her breath did something foolish and beyond her governing when he stood too near her at the gallery window, going over the figures they now both pretended required two people to check. And once, reaching for the same ledger at the same moment, her raw hand and his came near enough that she felt the warmth of him across the small, cold distance between their fingers, and neither of them moved, and neither of them closed it. And the not closing of it was louder than any word either had ever spoken. It was he who finally said the thing, because in the end it was always going to have to be him who crossed the distance, rank being what it was. He found her in the library one winter evening, where she had gone to return a book she had no business borrowing and had borrowed anyway. And he closed the door, which a viscount may do without ruining anyone. And he stood with the firelight on the pale scar through his brow, and he said her name. Not Miss Coyle. Esther. He had never used it before. It landed in the warm room like a stone into a still pool, and the rings of it went all the way out to the edges of her. I have spent my life, he said, learning to believe the person no one else will. He came a step closer and stopped, the way a man stops, who has decided to let the other person choose the last of the distance. I did not expect, he said, that believing you would cost me my heart along with my certainty. I am telling you plainly because you have earned plainness from me, and I have given you little else. I want you, not as a matter of gratitude, not as a reward for what you did. I want you, as a man wants the one person in a cold house who told him the truth when the truth was dangerous. He drew a breath, and for the first time since she had known him, the level voice was not quite level. Stay, he said, not as a servant. Stay because I am asking you to, and because I think, God help us both, that you want to. And Esther Coyle, who had been furniture that walked, who had been the sly girl and the tale carrier, and the woman with 2 gray gowns and £8 a year, closed the last of the distance herself. She had learned at last that she was permitted to. She put her raw hand against the front of his coat, over the loud proof of his heart, and she lifted her face to his. And the kiss when it came was soft and slow and full of everything they had not been able to say for the whole long, careful autumn. It asked a question, and it answered one, and when they drew apart she did not step back into her old smallness. She stood where she was, inside the circle of the warmth, and she let herself be seen. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small stone church at the edge of the estate, with the boy Thomas standing up beside them, grave and proud in a coat that fit him, and a scattering of the tenant families in the pews, and no diamonds and no season and no crowd of the great to render their verdicts. There was no one to overturn because Esther had already been raised by the only verdict that had ever mattered, spoken in a grey gallery by a man who had crossed a room to give it. Lady Prudence was not there. She sent no word. Somewhere in her narrow town she was growing old inside the exact life she had built for a child. And Esther, who thought of her sometimes, wished her neither harm nor happiness, only quiet, which was more mercy than the woman had earned and less than Esther's own peace required her to withhold. The house at Harrogate learned to be a home. The fires stayed large. The boy learned to ride, and rode out most mornings with his cousin, who was now by every law and every love something nearer than a cousin, and came back muddy and laughing in a way no one at that house had heard a child laugh in years. And Esther, who had once waxed the same 6 inches of banister for a quarter of an hour because her hands could not trust themselves, walked the long gallery of an evening as its mistress, and did not need to be a shadow any more, and found that she had almost forgotten how. On the anniversary of the morning she had knelt above the blue drawing-room and heard the thing she was never meant to hear. She went and stood in that same gallery, at that same place by the carved balustrade in the low gold light of a winter afternoon. The house was quiet below her, but it was a different quiet now, a warm one, a full one. She could hear the boy at the pianoforte in the drawing-room working through a phrase he had not yet mastered, stopping and beginning again with the stubborn patience of a child who has been told at last that he has all the time in the world. From somewhere near the stables came her husband's voice, low and level, giving some easy instruction to a groom. She rested her raw hand, no longer quite so raw, on the smooth wood of the balustrade she had once polished on her knees, and she looked down into the room where it had all begun, and she thought of the woman she had been, the one who had told herself it was not her house, not her boy, not her fight. She had been wrong about all three. It had become her house. The boy had become in every way that counted her own, and the fight had been worth the whole terrible cost of it, because on the far side of the fight was this: a warm gallery and a child's music, and a man who had believed her when belief was the most dangerous gift. In England. The pianoforte phrase came right, at last, downstairs, and held, and rang clear through the warm rooms of the house that the boy had kept and the maid had saved. Esther Coyle stood in the gold light and let it ring. If Esther's story stayed with you, stay a moment longer in the quiet of it before you go. And if you would, leave a word behind you about the moment that reached you most. Thank you for staying to the end.